The first sign is not a siren, it is the smell. Something between burnt rubber and old pennies, faint at first, the kind of thing you notice and then immediately decide you imagined. A commuter on a train platform sniffs twice, looks around, sees no one else reacting, and puts his earbuds back in. A woman walking her dog in a park watches the dog stop, nose up, ears flat. She pulls the leash. They keep walking. That's the moment the cloud arrives, not with fire, not with a warning, with a smell that the brain tries very hard to dismiss. By the time governments confirm what satellites have already shown, a planetary-scale atmospheric layer of toxic gas, dense enough at the surface to register, thin enough in the first hours that people are still arguing online about whether it's real. Around 2 billion people have already been breathing it for 6 hours. Here is what the scenario looks like, stripped to its core. A chemically reactive atmospheric event, let's call it a global toxic layer, a compound affecting oxygen uptake and cellular function, covers the entire planet simultaneously. Not a local gas leak, not a volcano, not a city. Everything. Every coastline, every mountain, every field, every suburb. The gas is not instantly lethal at the concentrations most people initially encounter. That's the important detail. And the terrifying one. If everyone fell over dead in the first hour, the response would be faster. Instead, it's slow. Headaches first. Fatigue. Disorientation. The human body adjusting to something it was never designed to adjust to. The virus playbook doesn't work here because there's no contagion model. You can't isolate the exposure. There is nowhere outside. The first thing that genuinely breaks is not hospitals, it's outdoor workers. Construction sites go quiet by mid-morning, not because anyone ordered them to stop, but because the men pouring concrete and welding joints and laying pipe are the first to hit real exposure thresholds. Heavy physical labor means heavier breathing, which means more intake. A roofer in Texas sits down on the edge of his beam and realizes he can't quite remember what he was doing. His hands are still holding his tools. He's not unconscious, he's just somewhere else. His foreman calls a break. Nobody argues. Farms are next. Any crop work happening outdoors, any livestock management in open fields, pauses within 12 hours. The global supply chain's most invisible dependency, the people who work outside all day, hits a wall before anyone else has registered the emergency. And here's the overlooked thing about that. The global food system is built for razor-thin timing. Harvests happen in windows of days, sometimes hours, not weeks. A delay at the field end is not easily recovered downstream. Nobody thinks about that in hour one. They're thinking about hospitals. Hospitals, meanwhile, are receiving a category of patient they genuinely do not have a protocol for. The symptoms look like carbon monoxide poisoning, altitude sickness, and anxiety, all at once, across every patient simultaneously. Triage fails not because the staff aren't skilled, but because triage depends on severity sorting. When every person walking through the door has the same complaint, "I feel wrong," the queue becomes meaningless. Doctors start moving patients based purely on visible distress, which means the people quietly deteriorating inside are waiting longer than the people dramatically hyperventilating. The smartest adaptation in the first 48 hours doesn't come from government. It comes from industries that already know how to work in bad air. Mining companies have masks, protocols, atmospheric sensors, and trained personnel who understand exposure limits before most people have Googled what's happening. Underground miners in Chile and South Africa are, temporarily, among the safest workers on the planet. Coal miners in sealed facilities have more functional infrastructure in this moment than most urban office workers. The mountain of safety regulations that the mining industry has accumulated over a century of tragedy becomes, overnight, the most relevant document in any building. Lawyers and engineers spend the first week in a frantic read of standards they never expected to need personally. Sealed environments become the new premium real estate. This is where the economic logic of the scenario gets genuinely strange. In normal life, a windowless basement apartment is a discount. Outdoors is the luxury. The apartment with the rooftop terrace costs more. The house with the big garden. Fresh air, literally marketed as a feature. Now the hierarchy inverts. The penthouse with the wraparound terrace is a liability. The sealed interior unit with mechanical ventilation becomes the most defensible place to be. Within days, the market for HVAC systems, air purifiers, industrial-grade respirators, and carbon filtration collapses under demand so heavy that most suppliers simply stop accepting new orders. A company in Germany that makes clean room air handling systems for semiconductor fabs becomes, without doing anything different, one of the most valuable businesses in the world. Their waiting list goes from 2 years to a number nobody wants to say out loud. Masks become stranger than during a pandemic, because during a pandemic, the mask is a social signal. Here, it's the only thing between you and cumulative exposure. The quality hierarchy matters. A 3-layer cloth face covering does almost nothing against a chemically reactive gas. An N95, marginally better. A proper elastomeric half mask with the right chemical cartridges, significantly better. And the population of people who own the right equipment before the scenario happens is almost entirely industrial workers, painters, pest control operators, emergency responders, and hobbyist woodworkers. The woodworkers become unexpectedly popular neighbors. Now, here's the thing that most discussions about a scenario like this get wrong early. The assumption is that the crisis immediately becomes a single, coordinated global emergency, with world governments synchronized, sharing data, issuing unified guidance. What actually happens, in every large-scale crisis, is that governments do what their own political and infrastructure moment allows them to do. Rich countries with functional stockpiles distribute equipment faster. Countries with already strained healthcare systems face triage failures at scale. The toxicity gap becomes a resource gap, becomes an inequality. A 40-year-old with a pre-existing respiratory condition in a wealthy suburb of Stockholm, and a 40-year-old with the same condition in a city with no functioning hospital infrastructure are inside the same global emergency with entirely different survival equations. The gas doesn't know borders. The response does. The outdoor economy stops. The delivery infrastructure, built on drivers who spend hours in vehicles moving through open air while loading and unloading, starts to fail within days. A sealed vehicle at highway speed offers some protection, but the minutes at each stop, the door open, the walk to the package, the return to the cab, it accumulates. Delivery workers, already one of the most economically pressured workforces, become simultaneously the most essential and the least protected. The internet holds. That's worth saying clearly, because the instinct is to assume that infrastructure collapses fast. Digital infrastructure doesn't need lungs. The servers keep running. Data centers are sealed, climate-controlled environments by design, staffed lightly, often automated. Fiber optic cables don't breathe. The grid needs workers eventually, for maintenance, for emergencies, for anything that requires a physical human in an outdoor substation. But in the short term, power stays on and the internet stays up, which means the one thing societies do in a crisis, frantically look things up and argue about it online, continues uninterrupted. Remote work, already normalized for a significant portion of white-collar employment after years of global adjustment, expands instantly. Companies that were still resisting hybrid models find the question resolved for them by atmospheric chemistry. What schools do is more complicated. A child needs to breathe more times per minute than an adult relative to body size. Outdoor play is impossible. The mental health framework for keep children indoors indefinitely doesn't exist, because no generation ever needed it to. Schools move online, which works for some students, poorly for others, and not at all for families where the home itself is not sealed or safe. The contrarian pressure in all of this is the timeline. People assume the scenario immediately feels like catastrophe. The honest truth about human adaptation is that it is almost embarrassingly fast. Within 2 weeks, the morning routine adjusts. You check your mask before you check your phone. You do not open windows. If you need to go outside, you plan the exposure like you once planned sun exposure. Duration, protection level, time of day. The gas, it turns out, has lower concentrations at night, when temperature gradients shift the layer. Night becomes slightly safer. People adapt their schedules. Delivery, maintenance, and emergency work begins to cluster around overnight hours. Cities go quieter in daylight, and stranger after dark. The long-term agricultural problem is the one that doesn't get solved by normalization. Crops need sun and open air. Controlled environment agriculture, hydroponics, vertical farms, sealed growing facilities has been expanding for years, but at the time of the scenario, it supplies a small fraction of global caloric needs. Scaling it up fast enough to feed 8 billion people is not a logistics problem. It is a physics problem. You cannot build enough grow lights, sealed greenhouse space, and nutrient delivery systems in weeks or months to replace what open field agriculture provides. The food system, which was already running on thin margins, begins to contract. This is the slow emergency inside the fast emergency. The crisis feels urgent because the symptoms are immediate. The starvation risk doesn't arrive on day 1. It arrives on month 4, month 8, month 12, as harvest yields drop, as fieldwork remains impossible at scale, as food prices climb in ways that are not reversible by policy announcement. The population that adapts best is not wealthy in the traditional sense. It is the population with the most self-contained infrastructure. Island communities that already run their own food supply chains. Rural families with enclosed properties and established food storage. Cultures with a historical tradition of indoor living and sealed spaces. Places where dense urban apartment living and interior design for air quality were already norms. The population that struggles most is the one that was most outdoor dependent and least able to pivot. Agricultural laborers, outdoor vendors, informal economy workers, anyone whose livelihood required being physically present outside. There is one second-order effect that almost nobody anticipates in the first month. It is vitamin D. The human body produces vitamin D through skin exposure to sunlight. A population that stops going outside, stops going outdoors for exercise, stops spending time in the sun, even with food and water and shelter managed, begins to develop widespread deficiency within months. Vitamin D affects immune function, bone density, mood, cellular repair. A population already stressed by toxic gas exposure and economic disruption begins to experience the compounding effects of living like it's always night. Depression rates climb in ways that feel unconnected to the main crisis until a researcher publishes a data correlation that suddenly makes every piece of it make sense. The supplement industry cannot meet demand? The irony is precise. The body needs the outside to stay functional, and the outside has become the thing you are surviving. Eventually, and this is the scenario's uncomfortable equilibrium, people don't stop living, they redesign what living looks like. Architecture begins the longest pivot in its history. The open-plan office, the glass facade building, the suburban house with the back deck and sliding door, all of it becomes legacy design. The new builds have air handling systems as a structural requirement, sealed entryways like decontamination chambers, indoor garden spaces with grow lights, because a window box of herbs has become a small act of survival. The outdoor cafe is not closed, it is enclosed. Every outdoor sporting venue finds a way to either put a roof on it, filter the air inside it, or stop operating. Sports don't end. They move. Track events inside warehouses. Soccer in vast sealed domes. The human drive to watch other humans compete turns out to be more durable than the specific infrastructure those competitions used to require. The word outside shifts meaning. Children born into this world do not have the reference point. For them, a sealed indoor environment is simply normal, the same way an air-conditioned room was simply normal for a generation that never used ceiling fans as their primary cooling system. And that normalization is the honest ending of this scenario, not collapse, not salvation. Just the long, expensive, uneven, determined process of 8 billion people rearranging every system they built for one version of their planet to work in a different version. What the toxic cloud reveals is not a new vulnerability, it is the original one. Every system humans build assumes the air will cooperate. The assumption is so foundational that nobody wrote it down, nobody put it in the risk model, nobody priced it into the insurance policy. The atmosphere was the one thing that was just there, until it wasn't. And then the question became not whether people would survive, but how quickly they could build a new definition of normal around the one thing they had never, in all of human history, needed to think about. The air they'd been breathing was always working quietly in the background. It just never needed a protocol before.